everybody. Welcome to Brotéria. It's a pleasure to have you all this evening. Thank you so much for Richard to come and visit us. This is a series of lectures that are sponsored by Santander Bank Foundation, and we are very, very grateful that Santander gave us the opportunity not just to get together, but to get together with friends that we otherwise would not have the possibility of inviting. This series is called Eutopos. So I think on a larger sense, throughout the world, we share this impression that the world is nowadays a troubled place. There are war, there's a lot of hate speech, there's a lot of difficulties throughout the world. But at Brotéria, we started around 2.5 years ago, we started to look for Eutopos. Eutopos is a Greek word, it means good places. So we truly believe that there are people, ideas, projects that are so inspiring that they deserve to be put on the spotlight so that we can all realize that even though our troubled world has a lot of difficulties, it still has a lot of very good ideas that can inspire our works, our personal lives, our family lives, our communities, cultural, religious, and whatnot. So this is this is the point of the series. Brotéria, our journal, we've been publishing since 1902. Since 1925, we'll be having cultural reviews. So on films, not that much in 25, but afterwards, books from the start. And thinking about the fact and the opportunity that it is to have cultural critics, people that help us to engage critically about our cultural productions and the things that we see that in a way capture our imagination, our hearts on an everyday basis, has always been a part of Brotéria. So we really wanted to reflect upon it and think how we could do it and think what it is that we are doing when we are doing it, which is also a very interesting thing. So because Francisco made this possible, Richard came to Portugal and to Europe, and we are very glad to have this wonderful opportunity to have him over. I'm going to present him. I mean, half the audience knows him better than I do, but I'll try it anyway. So Richard Leonard is a Jesuit priest, as I am too. He served on juries at Cannes, Venice, Berlin, Warsaw, Hong Kong, Montreal, Brisbane, and Melbourne International Film Festivals, and he has lectured on faith and culture all over the world. Richard has degrees in arts and education, a master's degree in theology. He has graduated his studies at the London Film School, and he has a PhD from the University of Melbourne. He directed the Australian Catholic Office for Film and Broadcasting for 22 years. As an honorary fellow of the Australian Catholic University, he has been a visiting scholar within the School of Theatre, Film and Television at the UCLA, and a visiting professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. As most of you know, Richard has been published in America Magazine, Eureka Street, US Catholics, and is a regular columnist at the London Tablets and is often on ABC Radio. He is the author of 13 books, nonetheless, including Movies That Matter, Finding Faith Through the Lens of Film, The Mystical Gaze of the Cinema, films of Peter Weir, which for those that might be a bit out of the movie scene, it's the director of Master and Commander and Dead Poets Society, for example, which I think we all have seen. So his bestseller, I think, is another title, Where the Hell is God? It's also a very provocative title for a very beautiful book on some particular issue, not exactly the one we are dealing with today, but also worth mentioning. So his later book, Why God, has been published in 2024. And he's currently a parish priest of North Sydney, Lavender Bay, Kirribilli, where I know some of you are originally. So it's a great pleasure to have you at Brotéria. Thank you so much for being part of this mapping of good places that we are trying to do over here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manuel. It's great to be here. And the rest of you have, there are 10 Australians in this room that I know of right now. That is a very dangerous place to be. Wonderful, but dangerous. But hopefully we will all be well behaved because we're on a Camino, and our Camino starts here now. And one of the things I was told when I became a Jesuit in Sydney, Australia, is that you can walk into, as a Jesuit, you can walk into any Jesuit community in the world, and even if you don't speak the language, you are at home. You've got a home, you've got a family, a spiritual family, and the hospitality of the last 24 hours can only possibly show that my novice master was a wise man in every possible way. Let's go to work because we are here, I'm here, to in fact explore what I hope is an interesting but a very important topic. The topic that we came with was the purpose of contemporary film criticism, and I assume it's Catholic film criticism because that was my background, of course, and on the role of film critics. So rather than wait till the end of this lecture, I want to go straight to my conclusion and then deduct what I think is important. The purpose of contemporary Catholic film criticism is to engage with the cinema through the lens of Catholic theology, ethics, aesthetics, and human experience. It aims not just to evaluate a film's technical merit, but also discern how it reflects or distorts truth, beauty, goodness, and the dignity of the human person. Core values, of course, in Catholic thought. Contemporary Catholic film criticism isn't about labeling a film as Catholic or not Catholic, as good and evil, as bad and enlightening. It's about watching deeply with the eyes formed by faith and drawing connections between the cinematic stories, our great narratives of creation, destructiveness, sin, and redemption, forgiveness, salvation, and eternity. While we're there, and I'm going to lots of footnotes tonight, I don't use the word sin in my teaching, in my writing, or in my preaching very much anymore. Not because I'm running away from sin, but it is such a loaded word, and also that a younger generation haven't got a clue what you're talking about. Or if they do, it's not exactly what we mean by it. And I thank God when I was teaching in universities in Australia, and I was trying to communicate, I was teaching a course on theology in the cinema. I was trying to communicate what it is about sin that we were exploring in and through a number of films that we were looking at. And thank God I was inspired one day to talk about destructiveness. And it does exactly what sin does. It destroys our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, my relationship with myself, and a relationship with the created order, with creation. So it's a terrific word to use. And as soon as I started using that word, every young person in the room knew exactly what I was talking about. And it didn't carry the baggage that it does sometimes for older generations. So a helpful idea and something on the way through. I just want to take you through a few things that we take into account as a Catholic film critic. The first, these are the 5 elements of it. The theological and moral reflection, engagement with culture, evangelization and discernment, a celebration of artistic beauty, and a witness to hope in a broken world. And I'll unpack a few things of why they matter and how they matter. We analyse films, I think Catholic film critics at their best anyway, analyse films and express or challenge Catholic teachings on topics like human dignity and suffering, forgiveness, mercy and redemption, vocation, sacrifice and love. And we hope we can offer insights into how media shapes or reflects cultural morality and spiritual beliefs. And now that's a very contested space, at least in my country, and I assume in Western democracies generally. I really like the idea of the cinema being a window into the culture. In a sense, a film, because they take so long, the gestation is so long, it's often a window where we were 1 or 2 years before. But it is often remarkable how contemporary a statement it is about where we are right now, who we are right now, particularly when a film takes off, when it becomes a very important film for the whole world, or for at least for a language group. There's something about that that has resonated strongly. And that's been one of the blessings of my ministry when I thought I would be in the production of film and television for my ministry as a Jesuit. But when, in fact, for a whole lot of reasons, that didn't eventuate in Australia, and I was moved often into criticism and film commentary. And one of the great things is that it also got me into the area of theology and culture, because I think the French, no doubt the Portuguese, but I'm more aware of the French. The French have for a century understood how important as a document about culture the cinema can be. It isn't always, but it can be. And they take it seriously. Australia, young democracies like us, we tend not to. We just still tend to see the cinema as an entertainment option. And it is that, or at least we hope it's that. That's a good thing. But it's so much more than that. And I think, therefore, it is this moment to have an insight into how it's shaping us and forming us. But I want to say more on that soon. Obviously, it's an engagement with culture. When the church says that it wants to engage with culture, unfortunately, it tends to say it's always about high culture. So it's about, like, there are bishops who will not let in the cathedral. I assume this doesn't happen in Portugal, but it certainly happens in Australia. Bishops who won't have anything but Haydn's Creation or Bach's B minor Mass. That can be played in the cathedral. But anything that isn't like that, oh, no. We couldn't have a pop concert in there. And we couldn't show a film in there that may not be explicitly religious. And I think this is a mistake. I think we should be wise about it and very discerning about what we're saying yes to, but engaging indeed. Because we're promoting a dialogue between church and contemporary society through art. And your magnificent institution here is a testimony to that, is trying to set up the context in which that dialogue occurs. And from what I've been able to glean in the last 24 hours, you're doing an extraordinary, a singular job. We have nothing like this in Australia, and it's giving me plenty of ideas. I'm going home to found Brotéria in my parish in North Sydney. We interpret cultural trends, anxieties, aspirations visible in the cinema. And you only have to think about, I want to come back to this, but the number one film in popular culture right now are the superheroes, where we want to be saved. What's going on there? And why has it been going on for so long? Because this is not a new phenomenon, but I promise I'll be back to it. We'll highlight where secular films touch on transcendent truths. I did my doctorate on Peter Weir. Peter Weir is not an explicitly religious man. He was raised as a Presbyterian, a Scottish Presbyterian in Australia, but he became a Jungian. He got very influenced by the psychology of Carl Jung in his time at university. And now I think he would consider himself to be an agnostic at best. But one of the things he said famously in this interview, where someone said, "Your films are very spiritual," he was a bit surprised and not particularly happy about that commentary. But then when he reflected on it, he said, "When I grew up a Protestant as a child, I remember thinking they had taken the mystery out of religion, that there was nothing mysterious." And so for him, the cinema became a moment to explore these transcendental ideas, these mystical moments. And indeed, he's made one film after another, Picnic at Hanging Rock, Gallipoli, Dead Poets Society, Witness, Master and Commander, The Year of Living Dangerously, The Last Wave. For cinephiles, these films are extraordinarily mysterious and indeed deeply religious, a small r, religious. Evangelization and discernment. Now, this is where most people think about Catholic film criticism, that we're there to tell you to go to a movie or not to go to a movie. And we give it, out of our Catholic 5 stars, it gets 5 or 1. In fact, we had a very famous, the founder of the office I ran for 22 years was an extraordinary man called Monsignor Fred Chamberlain. And Fred Chamberlain was a great man who'd come over to Belgium to do a doctorate in religious education. And it was between Paris and Brussels that in his young life as a priest, he started to see how seriously the European cultures take the cinema. And he loved the movies, but he'd never seen the seriousness with which he approached. So he came back to Australia and convinced the Australian Catholic bishops to found an office, a film office, and he became the first director. But he was he was quite strict in his appreciation of the cinema. And so he used to have not stars and not, a grading system 1 to 10. He used to have little phrases at the end of every review. So acceptable for Catholics, acceptable for thinking Catholics, which I always liked that distinction. We had dumb ones and we had thinking ones. And then he used to have morally objectionable in part for all, but his best one by far was simply one word: condemned. They were the only films we ever went to see. If Monsignor Chamberlain said that it was a condemned film, that was good enough for me. I knew I was going to enjoy it. And by the way, one of the big films of the time that he condemned, which I loved, was The Life of Brian. And Monty Python's The Life of Brian. I can vividly remember my Irish parish priest standing up and saying one Sunday, "Anybody who goes to see The Life of Brian is committing a mortal sin." We went that afternoon. And a very enjoyable couple of hours committing a mortal sin it was too. And of course, I've actually taught The Life of Brian and I've actually researched it. If you've actually seen the film, it's not having a go at Jesus. It's having a go at the church. Because the entire film is about hermeneutics. The whole film is hermeneutical. It's all about how has this message been interpreted and distorted. And who didn't like The Life of Brian? The churches. Because they knew that their power was being assaulted. What a surprise. And they tried to then say that it was an attack on Jesus. Jesus is a character in The Life of Brian. He is on screen for 1 minute and 32 seconds, and he is never parodied. What happens at the back of the Sermon on the Mount when he's saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers," at the back they can't hear, so it's "Blessed are the cheesemakers." So, well, what's so special about the cheesemakers? Well, it's not meant to be taken literally. It refers to any manufacturer of dairy products. So it's trying to say something quite different about hermeneutics. When you go with different eyes, you can see things going on that I think are only more helpful. But most people think that that's what Catholic criticism is there to do, to condemn and to tell you what to see and what not to see. I think also, in terms of evangelization and discernment, it encourages our media literacy. And I want to give you a little, what I hope is a helpful guide to that literacy tonight, because I think it's extremely important. I think we should be educating our children from the earliest years about their media literacy, because we've got to become better at being critical consumers. And it may not be in the cinema as much, but the online community, for instance. And now gaming, it goes right across the board of the critical consumption that we have to have. But more on that soon. It points towards films that inspire contemplation, the virtues and the values. I want to come back to that. And obviously calls us to have deeper faith. It's a celebration of artistic beauty. We want to recognize and affirm the aesthetical value of the cinema as a form of art, because it does glorify God through storytelling, visuals, and music. And just as some do it better than others, and others distort and indeed are, I think, alienating from seeing at least a hopeful or a generous understanding of the glory of God, many films that would not explicitly be religious do this nonetheless. And it's the same of any artwork. Some art alienates and pushes us away, others invites us in, others ask us to contemplate things that we may not be able to contemplate. And just like most art, the cinema creates a safe place, a safe space within which we can explore some of these meta themes of our life. It echoes the Church's historical support of the arts as encountering the divine, but I think we've got to be careful there. It's often been of the high arts, as they're often called. It's a certain type of art that has traditionally been embraced. And the problem with that is that fine when the community celebrated the high arts. So, for instance, Mozart was the pop king of his day. They were waiting for his next opera to come out in the way that now some people would be later waiting for Taylor Swift's next album or release to come out. And we didn't keep pace with that. Once the culture changed into mass media and to popular culture, we got suspicious of entertainment. And the cinema was caught up in that in the 20s and 30s. That's for another night. The final one, Witness to Hope in a Broken World. The cinema at its best does fantastic work at presenting hope, redemption, the possibility of grace, even amid sin, destructiveness, despair and suffering. You know, in this year of hope, I've been asked to give a lot of talks and lectures around Australia on this theme. I can't do better than showing a clip, which we won't be doing tonight, but showing a clip out of the Shawshank Redemption. I don't know if there's anybody here who hasn't seen the Shawshank Redemption, but in Australia, it is on television every 3 weeks. It and Billy Elliot are two films that seem to be constantly on free-to-air television in my country. So if you haven't seen the Shawshank Redemption and you're an Australian, that's because you've willfully chosen not to. And then I come along and I show you a long clip out of the Shawshank Redemption, which of course is an extraordinary exploration of the theme of hope in and through what is not a true story, but a powerful story of in fact, it's a very messianic story. It's a very salvific story where Andy Dufresne is a Jesus figure, a Christ figure, a redemptive figure. And it's not by accident it's called the Shawshank Redemption. Most of us, even Catholic theologians and priests, I've discovered, don't know that the word redemption comes from redemptio, to buy back. And he's buying back freedom that hope brings. It's to buy back our freedom. And we say that was bought back for us in Christ, or Paul said that in Romans anyway. Explore how stories, even tragic ones, can be part of a larger narrative of salvation. And now, we just stay with that for a moment. It's all part of the wider narrative of our salvation. Once we say that Revelation is this small, then all of a sudden it's where God doesn't dwell or can't dwell, which last I checked would be an exceedingly arrogant thing for us to say, that God cannot do that, won't do this. I think God's already showed us that to expect the unexpected, and there we will find God. And St. Ignatius, our founder, finding God in all things. Now, I assume he means finding God in all things except evil, because evil is non-God, but if we're open to where this revelation might occur. Now, as I said, there are some people, some Catholics and Christians, who have a very sharp distinction between the secular and the sacred. I think this is a serious error, but the Church itself, for many, many years, has promoted such an idea. And that they only want Catholic film critics to warn and condemn. The problem, and then they want the Church, or at least the things the Church supports and promotes, to be a refuge from a wicked world. To a degree, the monastic movement was part of that tradition, where we were creating the new Jerusalem on earth, and beyond the walls was the secular world. You had to keep it out. And then this purified convent of monks or nuns had to have the new Jerusalem, the realized Jerusalem now, a little taste of what was to come. So this has been a strong element, and indeed it's made saints and very holy men and women. So I'm not here to condemn it. I'm simply here to say that in fact it isn't true to Matthew 28, where Jesus says at the end of that gospel, go out to the world and proclaim the good news, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And for Jesuits being in this city with that text from which Francis Xavier left to come to our part of the world eventually, Not quite to Australia. He didn't get to us. Yeah, but he was for a while the patron saint of Australia. He's been dropped, but unfortunately. But it is that going out to the world. Now, by tradition, the people who heard the Great Commission, as it's called by biblical scholars, the people who heard the Great Commission died a martyr's death. The idea that going out to the world and engaging with the world is going to be on our terms, and people are going to come to us speaking our word, talking our talk, walking our walk, wanting to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. This is not true to the oldest of our traditions, where indeed we take the risks of going out to the world to engage with it on its terms, and then we harvest what we think are the links that we can make. And I think there's a perfectly legitimate, strong strand within both Catholic praxis and Catholic theology that has set this up. And so I think it's indeed fine to not have such a strong distinction between the sacred and the secular. The problem that is, the application of this theory then is that some Catholics would only want us to say nothing about popular films and the cinema. The problem is that it's assumed that we have nothing to say, that if we don't talk about the Marvel heroes, the superheroes, then we don't have anything to say. We have lots to say, and we should be saying it. I was so pleased is it this issue of Brotéria, where the Bob Dylan film is reviewed. That's precisely right, because so many people are going to see that film, and it is such a complex, wonderful film on multiple levels. If you haven't seen it, then you're going to after tonight. It also ignores the fact, and this is a fact, I've checked this between Portugal and Australia, that the largest group of cinema attenders are 14 to 25. Now think about that age group. This is incredibly formative of their values. You're really forming values at this point in your life. And because you are shedding your parents' values, you're on the way to claiming them as your own or coming to your own conclusions about these. And there's no evidence in either Portugal or the USA or Australia that Catholics are not in that group. In fact, they are in that group. So for us not to be part of this conversation, I think, is a serious error. I think it's just a mistake. So when we come to World Youth Day, it frightens me that there's very little about culture in there, or at least the ones I've been to and the ones I've seen. I hope that might be different in the future. But having a strand for music, even popular music, for popular culture, for popular film, I think this is setting up critical interaction. I think would be a wonderful use of, or a further wonderful use of those days with those young people. So I think the mission of Christ is best served by a credible, intelligent, gospel-based response to the narratives that are forming our cultures. That's, I think, the best thing we could ask of a Catholic film critic. But things aren't as bad as some people of faith want you to believe. I'm going to put you to work now, even our friends who are online with us right now. You can do this in your home or wherever you are right now. But I do want you to turn towards one another and answer a couple of questions. Leaving Bollywood aside, because it is the biggest cinema in the world, it was always second just to Hollywood, but 2 years ago, Bollywood became bigger than Hollywood because the writers' strike. There are lots of reasons why the Hollywood has contracted, but Bollywood hasn't, it's increased. But we don't tend to watch a lot of Bollywood films outside of India. But leaving that aside, I want you to try and come up with what are the top 20 highest grossing films worldwide, of all time, okay? The highest grossing. Then I want you to do the top 20 highest grossing films of all time adjusted for inflation, because that's really the only fair way to look at it, actually, because the recent films are going to dominate. But when you go back and have a look at a film from decades ago, of course, it's extraordinary to see what's there. And then I'd like us to look at the top 15 highest grossing religious-themed films worldwide of all time. You haven't got very long to do this. We don't have pen and paper, but just talk to those around you and we'll come up with a few titles and then I'll put it all together. I promise it won't be very long. It'll only be a few minutes. It up. Okay, thanks very much. I love the fact that some people are looking it up online. That is delicious. Excellent. I'll put you out of your misery. Here we go. I know that was hopelessly inadequate, but we don't have a lot of time. And so the 20 highest grossing films of all time are Avatar, Avengers Endgame, Avatar The Way of Water, Titanic. Zizi Han is a Chinese film, which didn't do extremely well except in China, where and in fact it did fairly well outside of China. But Star Wars The Force Awakens, Avengers Infinity War, Spider-Man No Way Home, Inside Out 2, Jurassic World, Lion King, The Avengers, Furious 7, Top Gun Maverick, Frozen 2, Barbie, Avengers The Age of Ultron, the Super Mario Brothers movie, there's wonderful, Black Panther, and Harry Potter. Now, a couple of things to note there. There's not an R-rated film there. There is, at least on Australian categories, MA15+, which is, for teenagers under shouldn't go. I'm not sure what the comparable Portuguese category should be. But if you want to make a very successful film in the world, don't make it too sexy and don't make it too explicitly violent. Implied violence, because some of those have got a lot of implied violence actually, but if it's fantastic violence, then in fact we know it's unreal. It creates a different world. So if you want to make that sort of a very successful film, don't make it too violent, don't make it too sexy, because that will exclude a massive part of your audience. And the other thing there is that we'll come back to this because it's really important. Science fantasy. Science fantasy is huge, and it has been for a very long time. I want to make some points about that. Now, adjusted for inflation, this one is fun. Gone with the Wind. Avatar is still there. Titanic, Star Wars, Avengers, The Sound of Music. How do you solve a problem like Maria? Oh, we could sing for the rest of the day. In fact, there is a famous story told in Australia about the Austrian ambassador turning up at some function, and someone said, "Oh, the Austrian ambassador is here. You have to. Does anybody know the national anthem of Austria?" "Oh, yes," the band leader said, "I do, I do." And next minute they started singing, "Edelweiss, Edelweiss." I don't think so. I think that we'll find that is not the XT. The Ten Commandments, Dr. Zhivago, Star Wars The Force Awakens, Jurassic Park, Star Wars, The Lion King's back again, The Avengers back again, Furious 7's back again, Frozen 2, The Avengers, Age of Ultron, Black Panther, Harry Potter, and The Dark Knight. The other thing to keep your eye on is animation films. Ever since Shrek, the very first Shrek was the one that changed the whole game. Because, you know, they've always been popular with kids, but they weren't that popular with adults. You take your kids to them because you sort of had to, but they weren't that interesting. Shrek changed the game because they became what was then, we now, obviously in cultural studies, we talk about intertextuality, the disclosure of one text for another. So the kids would love Shrek just because it was a lovely and beautiful animation film. And all of a sudden, the adults are seeing so many other allusions and quotations and, you know, it's a reference point to so, it was interesting. It was just enjoyable. So there were multi-levels. It was the game changer. And ever since, we've had some really, really first-class animation films, and there's going to be even more. Yep. Ben-Hur is going to in a minute. This one I can't reveal to you, but I'll just give because it's all on one. The highest religious films of all time is The Passion of the Christ. Is the number one, and look, by a long way. $622 million it grossed, US. And then The Chronicles of Narnia, which are extraordinary films, wonderful films. Heaven is Real, The Shack, I Can Only Imagine, War Room, Miracles from Heaven, God's Not Dead, Son of God, Prince of Egypt, an animation film, Soul Surfer, The Star, and Breakthrough. If you haven't seen Breakthrough, I really encourage you to see it. It's based on a true story, and it's a wonderful exploration of prayer. Every so often, these are what are called Christian films that tend to be made in the United States. They tend to be miracle stories. A lot of these are, or some of them are, but not all of them are. A film like God's Not Dead is a very interesting exploration of belief and unbelief. Why don't people believe? In a dramatic way, they try and have someone who says they don't believe in God, and they do it pretty well, I have to say. Because presenting that sort of topic in an accessible, popular manner is actually very, very difficult, coming up with a mechanism to be able to deliver that to a wide audience. So there are some terrific things there. The Passion of the Christ, I got in so much trouble for The Passion of the Christ because I personally didn't like the film. Not that it isn't beautifully made and wonderfully acted, it is. It's all of that. But the problem for me was it was like Mel Gibson, a fellow Australian, was waving the finger at us, saying, if only you knew how much Jesus Christ suffered and died for you, you would come back to faith. And the way he presented that is to make one of the most graphically violent films. And one example, because again, I've taught it, I've studied, I've written about it. The scourging at the pillar scene goes for 7 minutes and 64 seconds. Oh, that'd be long. 54 seconds. So it was an extraordinary time to sit there watching flesh flying and blood going. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Good Friday was a lovely day out for Jesus. Clearly, it was a gross, shocking, violent, terrible death and end. The problem is that to shock people into the violence of the passion of Jesus, I can't find that anywhere in the earliest Christian tradition. To shock people, to make it that graphic and gross. And I can't see any evidence that it worked. I don't know where people were moved. I was moved by parts of the film too. But when I gave it I said all of this in my review of it, and And in our film office, we had 3 reviews. We had mine, we had Father Peter Malone, who's a missionary of the Sacred Heart, who's a much older man than I am, and he talked about it was like the Stations of the Cross, which can be very significantly in your face. And certainly in Portugal and Spain, you too have can have a graphic portrayal of the actions of Good Friday in the piety of your churches. And then the third one was Jan Epstein, who the name might denote is a very, very well-known Jewish film reviewer. And I sent Jan to see the film as well. And she gave, I thought, one of the best reviews of the entire film. She said that it wasn't anti-Semitic, but she said, after seeing the film, I can see where anti-Semitism comes from. So I found that was a whole new set of eyes to have a look at that film. So it's an interesting film, but it's even though it's telling our story, it's telling it through a very particular lens, and that's not beyond the criticism of, I think, our own community about its own documents and texts, maybe more so. The 20 religious films adjusted for inflation, I didn't ask you about, you wanted to know about Ben-Hur. So the 10 Commandments, Ben-Hur, The Passion of the Christ, Noah, Heaven is for Real, I Can Only Imagine, The Shack, War Room, God's Not Dead, Miracles from Heaven. So the first couple of those you've probably seen. Son of God, The Star, Jesus Revolution, The Prince of Egypt, The Robe, Breakthrough, Soul Surfer, The Nativity Story, Risen, and The King of Kings. Now, I want to think about these science fantasy films. They're huge. These are the biggest ones of all time, and some of them, many of them, we've already named. But it's good to get them together. Avatar, Avengers, Star Wars, Avengers. The Chinese film's back, it is a science fantasy film. Spider-Man, Inside Out, Jurassic World, The Lion King. All right, now, why do we even think about them? Because for unchurched young people, it's a way of presenting superheroes, of which Jesus can just be another superhero. And I think this is problematic for theology. What do they have in common? I just want to do a quick case study about this. In mythology, literature, film heroes, they have shared traits. They almost are a man. We have Wonder Woman, Batgirl, Catwoman, and Black Widow. There are a few others, but it's almost always dominated. It is a very male-dominated world. The superhero world. They have extraordinary powers and ability. You can start to see the parallels with Jesus going through. A strong and superior moral code, a reluctance to kill, and they don't die. No matter what happens, they have to be alive at the end of the film. Their real identity is often a secret and an incredible origin story. Think of Mark's Gospel, the Markan secret, and then Luke and Matthew, the origin story of Jesus. So these are not insignificant parallels. Distinctive dress. I'm not sure that Jesus' sort of outfit, kaftan, would quite work that way, but he's not as distinctively dressed as Captain America, but he's going in the right direction. They work independently. Again, not so Jesus is out on his own a bit, but then when the companions come in, they have identifiable enemies. Well, that's certainly true. Independent means of wealth or financial support, a base of operation that's secret or unknown, and they're received very differently by common people to the authorities who receive them. So you can start to see the parallels. They're borrowing very heavily from the Jesus story and then adapting it and applying it to whatever it is of the Super Marvel comic series, for instance, as one example. Here's the problem. There are issues for us then with when you get generations now, because we've been getting this stuff for 30 years now, who've grown up and they've either been hostile to the church, they've been absent from the church, their own catechesis is impoverished, and their own sense of what Jesus is just part of a good bunch. He's just a nice bloke who did great things. But of course, that's not what we say. And Jesus, of course, for us he isn't a fictional character, even though we do have that wonderful distinction from Bernard Lonergan between truth and fact. So when we don't take the Bible literally, thank God, anymore, because it is not a book of fact, it's revealing religious truth. And it's an important distinction, which I think we should make much more clearly and much more loudly. In the New Testament, sign faith, one of the things that action heroes do is that they have one extraordinary, miraculous moment after another. And Jesus did too, but he was also critical of it and said, blessed are those who have not seen but believe, which is all of us. So it's not as though we're just looking for the next miracle to believe in. They've all got a special power. So they've got their web, or they've got their superpower, they're literally strong, or their bulk, the Hulk. But Jesus' superpower is sacrificial love and forgiveness. It's compassion and justice and truth. It's all of those things. This one's very important. There's a lot of literature, just trust me on this moment, that it's very patriarchal, we've already touched on that, but also it's utterly passive. So we don't do anything and we're saved. Think about every one of these narratives, that people can't do anything for themselves and someone has to come to save them. I think this has had dramatic impacts on our democracies. I think we look to political leaders now as being like superheroes. You come and save us. And the sense of our participation in that salvation. Because Catholic theology says that while I am offered salvation, I have to respond. I'm not coerced into faith. I'm invited into faith. And that's a really important moment. We're not coerced to believe and follow Christ. We're invited to follow Christ. But we've got generations now, if they're linking Jesus with, he's just another one who turns up to save the day, whether I want to or not. Well, that's not what we believe. You can believe and you cannot believe. You can walk away. You don't have to. And of course, in theology, the Dominicans and the Jesuits have been fighting about this for about 450 years. You think you have fights with your neighbours, you should join religious life in the Catholic Church. We fight for centuries. And the Jesuits here, and many others of you will know, that this came down to what was the debate about free will and grace. And it came down to one very interesting point of theology. Could Mary have said no to the angel? That became the little dispute point, the question, the disputon. The Dominican tradition is such as the grace of the Immaculate Conception. Our Lady had to say yes. She was prepared and given the grace to say yes to the angel Gabriel. The Jesuit tradition has always been, and to my knowledge still is, that there is nothing in the grace of the Immaculate Conception that takes Mary's free will away, so that while she could have said no, it makes the yes even better, because she's not God's victim, she's God's invitee. And now Pope Clement VIII in, I think it was 1668, I think it is, said to the Jesuits and the Dominicans, you're both right, now shut up. And the Jesuits are right, of course, there's no question about that. And when I become the Pope, I'm going to define that as such. Because we are invited into grace, we're not coerced into it. And I think that really matters. So we're not passive in our salvation. Jesus seeks us out for a relationship of love. That's very different to Superman, who just comes to save you and then goes away, except with Lois Lane. Most media, they like Jesus, but they reject the church. So when you look at something like most of the Jesus films, the way that people, it's hard not to like Jesus, but it's often the church that becomes the problem. We like Jesus, but the church, and that's fair enough to a degree, there can be a rejection of the church. The problem with that, of course, for those of us who know the process of revelation, is if you didn't have the church, you wouldn't have the primary access to the documents that get you to Jesus. So people think that somehow, like the Book of Mormon, that the New Testament fell out of the sky. Well, it didn't. It came out of 300 years of intense debate and the discerning and choosing and rejecting. And I'm the only person who will tell you this, but I am delighted that Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code. Not 70% of it is really very good research, actually. 30% of it is utter nonsense. But he was writing a novel. He didn't have to. He wasn't writing a book on a tome on Christian history. And yet he seemed to be, because he wrote so persuasively, and because people's own personal theology and sense of their own history and knowledge was so poor, that they believed everything in it. And so I would go to a barbecue in Australia for 5 years, and you'd get a beer and a burger, and within a minute someone would say, "Father, have you read the Da Vinci Code?" And I would spend the next 3 hours in a backyard in Australia talking about the formation of the New Testament, the role of Mary Magdalene as the first witness to the resurrection, the Constantine's baptism, and on it goes. Name me another theologian, pope, saint, who has been able to get Christian theology on the agenda of backyard barbecues. Dan Brown did. What did the church do? It tended to condemn the book rather than engage with the book. Who engaged with the book? Go back and have a look at last check, 37 books written and refuting the Da Vinci Code. They're almost all Protestant. We were a bit absent from the discussion. If we ignore it, it'll go away, or we've got nothing to say. Not sure about that. In fact, I think that we have to be very careful, because if you reject the church, you're rejecting the very way and the community through whom the Spirit works to bring forward the documents which are our primary touchstone back to the person and narrative of Jesus Christ. So it's not as simple as saying it's one or the other. Iconography matters. We get armor, swords, hammers, shields, ropes, claws, arrows, webs, or belts for the superheroes. What's Jesus' icon? The icon is the cross. And of course, it completely inverted the Roman Empire. By the time we've become the state religion, Tom Holland, of course, in his famous book, Dominion, if you haven't read it, I hope there's a Portuguese translation now. It's a stunning, he's an agnostic, I think, maybe even an atheist. And Tom Holland says, "I have no candle for Christianity, but you could not have where the care of the poor is now one of the primary responsibilities of the society, that the least and the broken and the marginalized have to be taken care of." He said that only happens when the cross, in fact, triumphs over the Roman Empire. It's a very, very interesting and wonderful argument. All right, so being a media marketplace, we're moving into the final bit now. How do we have a more positive relationship with film and media in general? Well, firstly, we don't have to be against everything. You know, Thomas Aquinas, Book 2, Part 2 of the Summa Theologica in 1256, he said that where there is justice, fidelity, self-care, prudence, mercy, and hospitality, there Christ is found too. So it doesn't have to talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary, the resurrection, or the Bible for us to like it. It can be much more subtle than that. If it's about justice, fidelity, self-care, prudence, mercy, and hospitality, then Christ is present. It's so totally akin to who Christ was and what he did. At the same time, we don't have to dismiss the vices and the deadly sins. You didn't know you were going to do the 7 deadly sins here tonight, but here we go. Pride, greed, envy, anger, lust, gluttony, and sloth. I want to bring back the word sloth. In English, we would say that's onomatopoeic. It is exactly the way that you would expect that word to sound in English. I'm not sure what it is in Portuguese. I assume it is equally wonderful. But the vices and the deadly sins, Thomas didn't say that they're the worst ones you can commit. He didn't say that. He's incredibly insightful, Thomas Aquinas, of human experience. We know that he was morbidly obese. We know that he had several other issues in his life, but boy, his insight was really interesting, because he said these seem to be places people get trapped. Isn't that wonderful? Being proud, greedy, envious, angry, lustful, gluttonous, and slothful, people get trapped there. Oh, that's really insightful. 13th century. Magnificent. And this is the dark side. We don't dismiss the dark side. If you go to an opera, you will get the 7 deadly sins over 3 acts. You know, the idea that, it's high art and they're singing glorious arias from whomever, they're all exploring all of this stuff all the way through. So the fact that it's dark doesn't worry us. We ask 2 more intelligent questions. Is it glamorized? Is it normalized? Some of the films that I have most been critical of are where they take pride, greed, envy, anger, lust, gluttony, and sloth, and they glamorize it. They say, oh, it's a wonderful way to live. Don't forgive anybody. Get even. Think of the number of retribution narratives we have now, of getting even. And that's playing out on the world stage. I'm not saying it's a correlation. I'm saying they're related narratives. They are. And while we're there, and also it's normalised. So there's nothing I can do about it. This is who I am. Well, that's not in our Catholic heritage. That's the season of Lent, the season of Advent, and of course the sacrament of reconciliation, of penance, are all moments where we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves down, and with God's grace turn around to metanoia. We move into a new and a better future, staring down the entrapment of the 7 deadly sins. Sloth, while we're there, my grade 3 teacher was an Irish nun, an Irish sister of mercy, and she loved the word sloth. She was 6 foot tall. Behind her back, her name was Sister Mary St. Benedict, and behind her back we called her Gigantor. And Gigantor loved the word sloth. She used to say, "You lot are the most slothful bunch I've ever had the misfortune to teach. I've never known the sloth like I know it in this classroom right now. And if you don't stop the sloth, you will be going to hell for eternity." And Johnny Davis was my best friend in grade 3. And he turned to me one day after one of these admonitions and he said, "What sloth?" I said, "I don't know, but we've got to stop doing it or we're going to hell." We didn't even know what it was. And of course, Sister was saying we were being lazy. In English anyway, that's not the best word for sloth now. The more contemporary word for sloth, which is so powerful, is apathy. And Francis Burke, the great political philosopher in 1758, I think, somewhere there, 1770 maybe, he said, "Evil reigns when good people do nothing." There's apathy. When we do nothing, there's sloth. And with violence, can we stop saying that you'll become a violent person if you play or watch violent films or games? It's the same as saying if you watch Westerns, you'll become a cowboy or a cowgirl. Now, it does feed in to a violent world. I'm not saying it, but there's no study that can show that a child who watches a lot of violent material perpetrates violence as an adult. What we do know, I don't know of this in Portugal, but I certainly know about it in New Zealand and Australia. The biggest factor for a young person to become a violent adult is growing up in a domestically violent house. So sometimes we want to say, oh, we shouldn't have all these violent games or all these violent films. Well, actually, most kids do not become violent as a result of watching those films. They, in fact, replicate what they see as the resolution of conflict in being violent in a domestic setting. That jumps up exponentially, at least in my context. And I want us to cultivate complete compassionate judgment and critical consumption. I said we were coming back to this. Do you know, one of the worst things that Christians have bought into is the commentary that we can't judge anyone or anything. You can't judge them. We're in no position to judge. We shouldn't be judging anybody. This is utter nonsense. This is just rubbish, and we should call it out. I think when we say don't judge somebody, what we're trying to say is don't condemn them. But it's a huge difference between condemnation and judgment. They're not the same thing. If somebody is sexist, homophobic, bigoted, racist, classist, all of it, I'm never going to say that's okay. Now, I'm not going to condemn the person, but what they're saying or doing right now is not right. So I have to take a stand. I have to. Now, I can do that with as much compassion and respect and charity as I can absolutely muster, but stand I must, because that's to follow Jesus. Sometimes people say, oh, you can't say this because Jesus didn't judge anybody. I don't know what gospel they're reading, but it isn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Jesus judges people on every single page of the New Testament. How? Compassionately, utterly, completely compassionately. John 8, without question, the most beautiful and poignant moment where the woman taken in adultery. Where are those who condemn you? Neither do I. Go and sin no more. There's a lot of judgment in that phrase, Go and sin no more. A lot of fright. So I want us to be very good at compassionate judgment and critical consumption. How are we going to do it? Well, this is John Pogente SJ. John is dead now, but he was a Canadian Jesuit who worked out of Montreal and then in Toronto. And he came up with the EABV analysis, and I think it's helpful. Event, attitude, behaviour, and values. What have I seen, and what have I just seen, and why did I watch it? So sometimes we blame the media or film for what it brings to us. Actually, it's very interesting to ask, what are we taking to it? Because what you take to it can destine what you take away. If you take boredom to the cinema, you'll go to the next thing that's on. If you take lust or arousal to the internet, I wonder what websites we might end up in. So you get what I'm saying. If what you take to it, we're not good on that analysis. We're good on blaming what comes to us. We're not good on the interaction between the two. Second is attitude. There's no such thing as attitude-free. Everyone's pressing a barrow, including what's not there. And in cultural studies these days, they use the phrase, or in English anyways, they use the phrase from the London Underground, mind the gap, that there's a gap between the platform and the train. Where's the gap? What isn't here? What isn't covered? What voices aren't heard? This is, like, for instance, the most perpetrated act of violence in your society and mine is domestic violence. That is the most perpetrated act of violence. What is one of the least shown on films, in films and television in comparison to its perpetration in society? Domestic violence. So why is that happening? Why don't we tell those stories more? Because the vast majority of writers, producers and directors and executives in film and television are men. Who are the greatest perpetrators of domestic violence? Not exclusively, but dominantly, men. This is absolutely not unrelated. So we have to look at what's it trying to communicate to me. What's there, what's not there. Behaviour. What's it trying to get me to do? Often to buy things, to want things, to desire. It's cultivating desire and trying to get good on that. That, you know, what holiday you want, what car you want, where you want the kids to go to school. All of these things are desires that are often given to us. Now, some people are better at resisting them than others, but it's there. And finally, values. You know, we know where our values are, Galatians 5:22. Paul says that what the Spirit brings is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, fidelity, and self-control. So we know what our values are. They're not a bad criteria. Some are going to be more present and absent than others in certain films, for instance, but it's not a bad criteria. What's this got to say to our world about love? Joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, fidelity, and self-control. I think that's quite a helpful process to go through. And finally, to become a good storyteller. Do you know, when you have a strong story, when you believe in your own story, the media, all the media, television, film, the internet, social media, it can do what it's meant to do. It can entertain you, it can educate you, it can infuriate you, it can extend you, it can do wonderful things. It can just entertain you. There's nothing wrong with just laughing, just enjoying something. That's a good thing. It doesn't all have to be heavy. But when you don't have a good or strong story, or when that is not as formed as it could be, the media will give you a story. And people can live vicariously in and through it. And one of the best examples I know of this is people who live through sporting teams. So where their soccer team, their football team, it has a big success. I'm happy. Where they have week after week after week of disappointment, I'm terribly sad. It's a good example. I know Australians who live so strongly through their football team that that will destine their mood for a week. That's a tragedy. It's called vicarious experience. The media will do it because it's created this sense of belonging. So, for instance, for a good number of people who don't come anywhere near a church to belong anymore, they'll belong to a sporting team. And that sporting team becomes something which can be incredibly... I'd love you, if you haven't already, to do something here in the centre on sport, because it is so important in every culture. And it leads to very, very interesting relationships of people that we don't often come in contact with. which is important. So I think the final thing I want to leave you with is to be good with other people's stories, listening to them, holding them with respect, challenging them sometimes, because of what we hear must be challenged, while respecting the person who's telling. And then for our own story, doing anything and everything that we can to see our own story just get richer and more noble. And then I think once that happens, my story is strong enough to become the best consumer and the most compassionate critic of cinema. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much. There's still some time. We can ask some questions, react, express our disappointment because the blockbusters we hoped are not the ones who sold the most, and other different opinions. If there's any, okay, so we have to do this in a very merciful way for all those who are at home. So we're gonna have to wait for the microphone, Cynthia. Yeah.
I'm just curious of one thing. It seems the superheroes is a dominant thing, but I'm surprised that no biographies of real people, call it Gandhi, call it Braveheart, call it Gladiator, call it Lawrence Arabia, call it, name it. No one appears here. Why is that?
I haven't seen any research on it, to be honest. They do well. Like Gandhi was an extremely successful film for its year, but it just, the audience reach, here's my hunch, it's only my hunch. The audience reach for biography is an older audience, and I'm not sure that a 16-year-old cares what Gandhi said or did, not because it's not important, but because it isn't as Mandela, you know, because it's not as exciting as watching Superman 10 or Lethal Weapon 14, which is sad. But I think when you get older, as you mature, when you're looking to navigate the moral life, the ethical life, you're looking to see how other people did that, or you're wanting to be inspired by them to do that. And I'm not saying young people don't go to see these films, they do, but I think they would be, it's sophisticated, it's a more mature. It also demands more of the audience. They're quite demanding films. I've just, on the plane coming here, the 24 hours from Sydney to Lisbon, this is the longest trip I've ever done to give a talk in my life, 24 hours and I'm here. That one of the films that they had on Emirates was Bonhoeffer. The recent film on Bonhoeffer, and I'd been meaning to see it in Australia, and I was delighted to see it on Emirates. But it's not an easy film. But I found it, I was almost in tears, not because it's some soppy love romance. It was just powerful about his own utter resolution in the end that he had to give his life for the sake of the Christian gospel and Nazism. Yeah.
So there's another one already.
An idea of 4 films, so your approach with 4 films, 2 between conflicts between church and civilization, like Silence, the Scorsese, and The Mission.
Right.
Another type is about the mystics of the 2001 space odyssey. If you think that is a religious concept, or is it Christian?
Well, there are 3 questions in there. The second one is the easiest one, so I'm going to go to that one. The other
film was The Last Temptation of...
Oh, yeah, okay, right. Yeah. The Kazantzakis novel, yes. I didn't particularly like let's go with your last point first. Last Temptation of Christ, it's not an easy film to watch. You know, but in fact, it's where we came to a judgment. Because Christians need the story to be told as we know it, or some Christians need the story to be told as we know it. Kazantzakis, of course, in the novel, and it was in Scorsese's film, that, was it Scorsese? Anyway, it was in the film, Scorsese, yeah, where Jesus has a fantasy on the cross about what life would have been like if he'd gone off with Mary Magdalene. And so we go through this, you know, that they consummate their relationship. Now, people are horrified by this. Personally, I remember watching the film and thinking, if I was gasping for breath on a cross, the last thing I would be doing is having a sexual fantasy, I think. But I don't really ever want to be in the position to be able to test my own theory. But, you know, it is an interesting idea. He was looking at his choices. But if you get to the end of the film, it's a resolution and Jesus dies on the cross. So I always found it odd that there were loads of Catholic commentators who were condemning the film. And I wondered whether they actually got to the end, because it interrupted the iconography. Whenever anybody interrupts our iconography, that can be very challenging. I'll give you an example. In every Jesuit school that I've ever taught in, high school that I ever taught in, I suggested that we should have black images of Jesus in the school. And, you know, as soon as you put up black images of Jesus in the school, didn't take anything away, so the Sacred Heart was still there and very traditional statues and images of Jesus. It was the staff that often got quite worked up and said, oh, we've gone all politically correct now, have we? And I'd say, no, we've gone historically correct. So now let's talk about your racism. Because it's not until someone starts playing with that you realize how attached to you are. You know, I think the Jesuits may agree with me here, but there are, it's often said of Jesuits that we're all very happy to go and meet Jesus, and we're terrified to meet St. Ignatius. Because, you know, the image of St. Ignatius, you know, he can't be ever, no challenge of St. Ignatius can ever be entered into. It's nonsense. It's become a fetish almost, a fetishization of Ignatian spirituality or Ignatian. But he's important and he matters, obviously. But that you can play with it and you can get new insights into it. Back to the mission, and what was the other film you went? Silence, yeah. I thought Silence was, again, Scorsese, so it's interesting we're staying with Scorsese. Scorsese, that film, I just thought it was too long. It was a long time. I think it was almost 20 years or 30 years maybe from the time he wanted to make the film to the time he got it. It felt like 30 years watching it. That said, it was immensely moving. If you stayed with that film, it's over 3 hours long. If you stay, and slow, it's quite deliberately slow. But I found it deeply moving. I just would have moved the action along a bit myself. And the mission, well, it's no surprise that I love the mission. And the funny thing is about the mission is that you think that the conversion of the film, the Mendoza conversion, you would think that's the end of the film. And of course, it's only about 60% of the way through, because then we get the next 40% of the film, the last act, the third act of the cinematic opera, is of course the application of his relationship with the Guarani, and then the passive resistance versus the violent resistance of evil, and knowing full well that there's an argument for both here. You can make a perfectly good argument for both. So that was a much more complex film. I probably won't touch your first question on mysticism, where there was something about mysticism, and I don't remember what that was now.
House rules. You're not obliged to answer all the questions.
Oh, thank God.
You can just pick and choose.
Good.
So there's another one over there.
We've got one, and one at the back.
Yeah, probably we start with Rita at the back to have a lady speaking. No, at the back. The ladies, yeah. Not Manuel.
Thank you. This is delightful. Thank you. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the technological advances that are happening now in the industry, especially with AI coming, and how those are impacting what we watch, what we care about, and especially the superheroes.
Yeah. Now anybody can make a film. You really, seriously, anybody can make a film. The editing programs that you can buy and learn are very sophisticated and very good. The cameras that you can now buy and use are, they're not quite cinema grade, but they're getting there. So that's a good thing. That's a democratization. We're not waiting for studios to tell us what we want. And of course, now people are sharing. That's why TikTok's taken off. people are sharing stuff online. They want short, accessible material. Now, I'm not for a moment holding up a candle of TikTok. I'm not on it. And I do worry about what people post there, and I worry how much disclosure of their own life, that they film a lot of their own life. That worries me generally about the internet. In psychology, they talk about inappropriate disclosure, that there is a good thing to be disclosure. You know, it's like when you go to a wedding reception and you sit next to somebody and they want to tell you their entire life story in the first half hour. You have never met this person before in your life, and they want to tell you. It's what's called inappropriate disclosure. And I think this technology aids and abets that, because it doesn't set up a relationship. That said, there are going to be stories made that haven't been seen before, which then become the impetus to more professional production. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag. It is a mixed bag right now. AI. I'm a big fan of AI, and I think we have to live with it. Somebody in universities, you know, has been in university, and I'm still an honorary fellow of the Australian Catholic University. There are all these seminars and all of these things, and on the whole, academics are both suspicious and anxious, and I get some of it, but it's like saying, you know, I'm going to be anxious and suspicious about the internet. We just have to get used to it, and we have to use it in the best possible way. And as with every piece of media that we've ever had, remember that people didn't like the cinema when it first started. They didn't like photography because they thought it stole something from your soul. So, you know, they didn't like the opera. They couldn't stand Mozart. The Magic Flute was condemned outright as being like pornography of its day. Now, people will now pay a lot of money to go and see the Magic Flute, and it's considered high art. So every media has both a plus and a minus, or multiple pluses, multiple minuses. And we just have to get sophisticated in the way we do it. I think one of my major problems with AI at the moment is copyright, that people won't get paid and for the work that they put in. And I'll give you an example of a good friend of mine who works in AI in Australia. And I told him recently that I'm writing book number 14, and I'm having great trouble finding the time to write it, because these 10 parishioners that are in this room, they're so, you know, they take up all of my time. And so I don't get to write. And
you terrible people.
Yeah, you terrible people. Yeah, no, I love them. And but he said to me recently, he said, have you got a, now I'd never heard of this before. Others in this room this might be all very passé. But he said, have you got a PDF of all of your books? And I said, yes, I do. He said, send it to me. I'm going to load it into a private AI file, which you'll be the only person to have access to. And then I could put in and ask AI, write me a book on the life of St. Ignatius Loyola in the style of Leonard SJ, and it will generate that book. Now, because it's picked up my pattern and what I do and how I do it, I'm actually interested to try that. And as long as you disclose that to the reader, I don't even see that's an ethical problem, because it's my work in a sense, or it's at least AI and my work in a sense. So I think you just have to disclose. So I think it's here to stay. I think it's going to dominate education. I think it's going to dominate entertainment. My worry is, how do we come with a sufficient mechanism to respect copyright, particularly people who don't want those images used when they own them, and how they get paid for them. People have a right to their income. So there's some of the early, and there are ethical things, you know, about stealing stuff. Yeah.
So, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. That was really interesting. To look at those top film categories. There's 2 points, two things that you made, and I wanted to ask you about the effect of commercialisation in relation to filmmakers and the messages that they want to give. And one of the things that you said was around the domestic violence thing not being a strong topic in terms of movies, etc. And yet also mentioned the top religious movement being the Mission, which, if I recall correctly, was financed entirely by Mel Gibson because
The Passion.
of his passion. Because he wanted to make it in the way that he wanted to make it, and touching on those two particular differences, what would you say is the overarching commercial impacts on filmmakers delivering the message that they want to give rather than the message that they have to give in a sacrifice on your commercial success?
Yeah, well, it's real because if any of you are filmmakers and film students, people who want to work in the industry, it's a very tough industry to make a living out of. And it's true as an actor, it's true as a writer, it's a producer and a director, right across the board. But it is related to the previous question, which is that people are now finding other ways to make high quality stuff. So I'll give you an example. Sundance Film Festival is it has been famous for having independent films. In fact, that's what it's there for. Indie films. And increasingly it's showing films that are very, very, not just low budget, but no budget. They have a whole section now of that film festival, which I think is much to their credit, of showing those films. So if you can get a story which is worth, get somebody to fund even a 10,000 or a couple of tens of thousands of dollars and get all your actor friends to be in it. That's how some really good films, very interesting films are made, or at least the idea is made, and then somebody might notice that's a great film, but it needs a much bigger budget, and then there's another process after that. So there are ways of going ahead with it. The problem for commercialization is when you have happy endings and everybody's a bit sad and depressed, they don't want more sad and depressed. So you can't tell the film. You might want to tell a film about Ukraine right now. Getting that film made would be extremely difficult. You might want to tell a film about Gaza and Israel right now. Getting money for that film right now would be very, very difficult because people say, well, we know the world's bleak. Why would I want to go and see anything more bleak? But of course, it's exactly, there are filmmakers, I know, several projects right now on both of those topics. Then we have to, there is a market, there is an audience for every well-made story. It's a question of getting there. Because the one link in the commercialization which we need to think about is distribution. You can make the great piece, and if you don't get picked up by Sundance or one of the other film festivals, how do you get it distributed? Well, of course, the internet becomes one of those options, but that's more control than people actually think, and particularly for long pieces. You might do TikTok and all that stuff, but once you're doing up to a 60, 70, 80, 90-minute film, that takes up a lot of space, and someone's going to come along and say, no, that's not happening, or you're going to have to pay to rent the space, for instance, and they could take it down if it's controversial and they don't like your stance on Gaza or they don't like your stance on the Ukraine, then it's going to be censored. That's another form of censorship. So the commercialization but it's true right across the board of all the arts.
So last two questions before we get to the free wine for everybody. So Manel and then Katerina, and then we close it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I was hearing you talking about time and the amount of time that some movies require to be seen, and also about icons. And when I was seeing the 15 Christian movies, my head went to The Kingdom of Heaven from Ridley Scott, which is not at the first sight a Christian movie per se, but probably due to the fact that the production, they decided to cut the original vision of Ridley Scott. So I'm a fan of historical movies, but once I saw the director's cut, it changed completely the movie to me, and it became more spiritual and very related to what you said about the icons and what Jerusalem represents for the Christians at the time, maybe for the Christians now. So I don't know, I would like to hear if you saw the movie, the director's cut, if you have some thoughts about it.
I didn't see the movie, so I can't comment on it. Ridley Scott, of course, a very, very interesting filmmaker, and he has had a dramatic impact on the cinema in general. Historical dramas, of course, have come back into their own since, what was the multi-part medieval/fantasy television? It was huge. Westeros and
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. So there's an interesting example of where they're taking that historical story or the setting an historical situation, ultra violent, and quite explicitly sexual too, sexy in part. But why did everybody watch that? Why did that become a phenomenon? Similar to Ridley Scott with that film. These historical dramas, I think it's safer to look backwards, and sometimes even to look backwards and make it a fantasy about dragons and all of this sort of stuff. When it's all about conflict, it's all about the vying for power and who will be the most powerful and who's the last one standing. So sadly, I can't comment on the film because I've got another film to go and see. So thank you for that. I'm going to do it, I promise. So thank you for that. But I do think that Ridley Scott generally and the genre has actually exploded, but not in the way that in telling us an absolutely strict historical story. Now it'll have multiple other elements within it with broad appeal for the superhero crowd.
Katerina, for the very last question.
Thank you, Richard, for your presentation. It was very interesting. Something I noticed from the list of the 20 movies is it doesn't seem to me a coincidence, the fact that behind most of those movies, Disney is behind them. So I was wondering if
What's behind them?
Disney,
Disney, yeah.
Disney, the company. So it seemed to me that those numbers could be also the result of very strong or even aggressive marketing strategy.
Yes.
The same with Barbie. So I was wondering, on some level, could the public be a hostage of those strategies?
Yes. Yes, you could make a very strong argument for that. The Disney company, of course, has been taken over twice, but it's such a reliable brand that parents feel very safe with it. There's now a Disney Channel. In fact, they make much more complex films now, and they don't make Bambi Come Home every 2 weeks. As good as Bambi Come Home was, might be. But it's reliable, and people know that it's going to be very well made, whether it's animation or whether it's an action film. You're absolutely right about marketing. It is about marketing, and most dominantly that's an American market too, because the US is still per capita population the biggest attenders at the cinema after India in the world, and a film that comes out on Thursday can, people they won't talk about the film so much, they'll talk about the box office, which is actually pretty revealing. That's exactly what you're talking about, the commercialization, the marketing. What did well at the box office? Because then there's a sense of, I have to go and see a popular film. If everyone's going to see the film, I have to go and see the film. And hopefully they're doing it because they've also read reviews and they're interested or engaged by the topic. But sometimes there are marketing phenomena. And of course, that's what the marketeer wants. That's exactly what they want. They're in to make money. And they do have investors. So it's a huge business. It's a massive business. And it has been incredibly distorted. Like, for instance, the best films in the world could not ever be judged by what wins an Oscar. As good as, some very fine films win Oscars, but some very bad films win Oscars too. And, I'll give you one example. Judi Dench, who is a fantastic British actress, won her first Oscar for being Queen Elizabeth I in Shakespeare in Love, and she was on the screen for 1 minute and 12 seconds. She won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. Even she was shocked that she got nominated, and she said after she thought it was absurd when you looked at the performances by the other one. Now we know that Harvey Weinstein and that company who'd made Shakespeare in Love had discovered that there had been the tilt of voters for the Oscars, and that most of you have to go and see the films, and most of them weren't able to get out and see the films. So what did they do with Shakespeare in Love? They sent them a DVD player and sent them a DVD. And they sent a technician, if they didn't have it, to set it all up in their home so they could look at that film and then they could do their voting. Now, in one level, that's just very clever, very, very clever. But it also distorts then the move to excellence, rewarding excellence. So I'm a bit worried about awards, I have to say. I think so many other factors come into play there. But then, I've been on juries where we've given awards, and on the jury side, I much prefer film festivals, to be honest, because they tend to be professionals. Well, there are in the Oscars too, but it tends to be a hotly contested place to argue over a film, and it is the best one we saw. And that can be very rewarding, and often it can be a small film that somebody would overlook that can come through because it's such a powerful story. It is the power of story ultimately.
Thank you so much. I think we said by the beginning, I said we are trying to look for good places, Eutopos. And I think Richard really helped us to see, as his thesis, and I agree with it, that critical thinking and cultural consumption of films is not just about labeling things, of separating things between Catholic and not Catholic. It's much more deeper, much more intelligent, much more interesting than it. So, besides Santander, who of course sponsors these lectures, we always have another sponsor, Casa Sanchoima, who offers free drinks. So there's Portuguese wine in the back, so we can just have a good talk and share a glass of wine and keep asking all the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't make it to you, but again, so there's, for the Portuguese readers, there's a beautiful journal, Brotéria. For all the English-speaking ones, next Eutopos lecture will be also in English by a French professor. It's called Learning Through Mistakes, the Productivity of Misreading, about great ideas in the philosophy field that came out of people who misread other authors. So it's a very hopeful experience because it gives us opportunity that even though we might do mistakes, life can make eggs out of these very difficult opportunities. So thank you so much, Richard, and thank you, everybody. Have a nice drinks.